He walked into the living room with his morning coffee, only to find his own name written on the floor in blood.
Part 18 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Captain Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Benjamin Tapner, John Cobby, John Hammond, Richard Mills the Younger, and others, executed for murder. We do not recollect ever to have heard of a case exhibiting greater brutality on the part of the murderers towards their victim than this. The offenders were all smugglers, and the unfortunate objects of their crime were a custom-house officer and a shoemaker, named respectively William Galley and Daniel Chater. It would appear that a daring and very extensive robbery having been committed at the Custom House at Poole, Galley and Chater were sent to Stansted in Sussex to give some information to Major Battine, a magistrate, in reference to the circumstance. They did not, however, return to their homes, and on inquiry it turned out that they had been brutally murdered, the body of Galley being traced by means of bloodhounds to be buried, while that of Chater was discovered at a distance of 6 miles in a well in Harris's Wood, near Lee, in Lady Holt's Park, covered up with a quantity of stones, wooden railings, and earth. At a special commission held in Chichester on the 16th of January 1749, the prisoners Benjamin Tapner, John Cobby, John Hammond, William Carter, Richard Mills the Elder, and Richard Mills the Younger were indicted for the murder of Daniel Chater, the 3 first as principals, and the others as accessories before the fact, and William Jackson and William Carter were indicted for the murder of William Galley. From the evidence adduced, the circumstances of this most horrid murder were proved, and it appeared that the 2 deceased persons, having passed Havant on their road to Stansted, went to the New Inn at Lee, where they met one Austin and his brother and brother-in-law, of whom they asked the road, and they conducted them to Rowland's Castle, where they said they might obtain better information. They went into the White Hart, and Mrs. Payne, the landlady, suspecting the object of their mission, sent for the prisoners Jackson and Carter, and they were soon after joined by some others of the gang. After they had all been sitting together, Carter and Chater called out and demanded to know where Diamond, one of those suspected of the robbery, was. Chater replied that he was in custody, and that he was going against his will to give evidence against him. Galley, following them into the yard, was knocked down by Carter on his calling Chater away, and they then returned indoors. The smugglers now pretended to be sorry for what had occurred, and desired Galley to drink some rum, and they persisted in plying him and Chater with liquor until they were both intoxicated. They were then persuaded to lie down and sleep, and a letter to Major Battine, of which they were the bearers, was taken from them, read, and destroyed. One John Royce, a smuggler, now came in, and Jackson and Carter told him the contents of the letter, and said that they had got the old rogue, the shoemaker of Fordingbridge, who was going to inform against John Diamond, the shepherd, then in custody at Chichester. Here William Steele proposed to take them both to a well about 200 yards from the house, and to murder and throw them in. But this was rejected, and after several propositions had been made as to the mode in which they should be disposed of, the scene of cruelty was commenced by Jackson, who, putting on his spurs, jumped upon the bed where they lay, and spurred their foreheads, and whipped them, so that they both got up bleeding. The smugglers then took them out of the house, and Mills swore he would shoot any one who followed or said anything of what had occurred. Meanwhile the rest put Galley and Chater on one horse, tied their legs under the horse's belly, and then tied the legs of both together. They now set forward, with the exception of Royce, who had no horse, and they had not gone above 200 yards before Jackson called out, "Whip 'em, cut 'em, slash 'em, damn 'em," upon which all began to whip except Steele, who led the horse, the roads being very bad. They whipped them for half a mile till they came to a wood ash, where they fell off, with their heads under the horse's belly, and their legs, which were tied, appeared over the horse's back. Their tormentors soon set them upright again, and continued whipping them over the head, face, shoulders, etc., till they came to Dean, upwards of half a mile farther, and here they both fell again as before, with their heads under the horse's belly, which was struck at every step by the horse's hoofs. Upon placing them again in the saddle, the villains found them so weak that they could not sit, upon which they separated them, and put Galley before Steele, and Chater before Little Sam, and then whipped Galley so severely that, the lashes coming upon Steele at his desire, they desisted. They then went to Harris's well, and threatened to throw Galley in, but when he desired that they would put an end to his misery at once, "No," said Jackson, "if that's the case, we have something more to say to you." And they thereupon put him on the horse again, and whipped him over the downs until he was so weak that he fell off. They next laid him across the horse, and Little Sam, getting up behind him, subjected him to such cruelty as made him groan with the most excruciating torments, and he fell off again. Being again put up astride, Richards got up behind him, but the poor man soon cried out, "I fall, I fall," and Richards pushed him with a force, saying, "Fall and be damned." The unhappy man then turned over and expired, and they threw the body over the horse and carried it off with them to the house of one Scardifield, who kept the Red Lion at Rake. The landlord remarking the condition of Chater and Galley's body, the fellows told him that they had engaged with some officers, had lost their tea, and that some of them were wounded, if not dead. This was sufficient, and Jackson and Carter carried Chater down to the house of the elder Mills, where they chained him up in a turf house. Their companions in the meantime drank gin and brandy at Scardifield's, and it now being nearly dark, they borrowed spades and a candle and lantern, and making him assist them in digging a hole, they buried the body of the murdered officer. They then separated, but on the Thursday they met again with some more of their associates, including the prisoners Richard Mills and his two sons Richard and John, Thomas Stringer, Cobby, Tapner and Hammond, for the purpose of deliberating what should be done with their prisoner. It was soon unanimously resolved that he must be destroyed, and it was determined that they should take him to Harris's well and throw him in, as it was considered that the death would be most likely to cause him the greatest pain. During this time the wretched man was in a state of the utmost horror and misery, being visited occasionally by all his tormentors, who abused him and beat him violently. At last, when this determination had been arrived at, they all went, and Tapner, pulling out a clasp knife, ordered him on his knees, swearing that he would be his butcher, but being dissuaded from this, as being opposed to their plan to prolong the miseries of their prisoner, he contented himself with slashing the knife across his eyes, almost cutting them out, and completely severing the gristle of his nose. They then placed him upon a horse, and all set out together for Harris's well, except Mills and his sons, they having no horses ready, and saying in excuse that there were enough without them to murder one man. All the way Tapner whipped him till the blood came, and then swore that if he blooded the saddle he would torture him the more. When they were come within 100 yards of the well, Jackson and Carter stopped, saying to Tapner, Cobby, Stringer, Steele and Hammond, "Go on and do your duty on Chater, as we have ours upon Galley." It was in the dead of the night that they brought their victim to the well, which was nearly 30 feet deep, but dry, and paled close round, and Tapner having fastened a noose around his neck, they bade him get over the pales. He was going through a broken place, but though he was covered with blood and fainting with anguish of his wounds, they forced him to climb up, having the rope about his neck. They then tied one end of the cord to the pales and pushed him over the brink, but the rope being short, he hung no farther within it than his thighs, and leaning against the edge, he hung above a quarter of an hour and was not strangled. They then untied him and threw him head foremost into the well. They tarried some time, and hearing him groan, they determined to go to one William Comleys, a gardener, to borrow a rope and ladder, saying they wanted to relieve one of their companions who had fallen into Harris's well. He said they might take them, but they could not manage the ladder in their confusion, it being a long one. They then returned to the well, and still hearing him groan and fearful that the sound might lead to a discovery, the place being near the road, they threw upon him some of the rails and gateposts fixed about the well as some great stones, and then finding him silent they left him. Their next consultation was how to dispose of their horses, and they killed Gallies, which was grey, and taking his hide off, cut it into small pieces and hid them so as to prevent any discovery. But a bay horse that Chater had ridden on got from them. This being the evidence produced, the jury, after being out of court about a quarter of an hour, brought in a verdict of guilty against all the prisoners, whereupon the judge pronounced sentence on the convicts in the most pathetic address, representing the enormity of their crime, and exhorting them to make immediate preparation for the awful fate that awaited them, adding, "Christian charity obliges me to tell you that your time in this world will be very short." The heinousness of this crime, of which these men had been convicted, rendering it necessary that their punishment should be exemplary, the judge ordered that they should be executed on the following day, and the sentence was accordingly carried into execution against all but Jackson, who died in prison on the evening that he was condemned. They were attended by 2 ministers, and all, except Mills and his son, who took no notice of each other, and thought themselves not guilty because they were not present at the finishing of the inhuman murder, showed great marks of penitence. Tapner and Carter gave good advice to the spectators, and desired diligence might be used to apprehend Richards, whom they charged as the cause of their being brought to this wretched end. Young Mills smiled several times at the executioner, who was a discharged marine, and having ropes too short for some of them, was puzzled to fit them. Old Mills, being forced to stand tiptoe to reach the halter, desired that he might not be hanged by inches. The 2 Mills were so rejoiced at being told that they were not to be hanged in chains after execution, that death seemed to excite them in no terror, while Jackson was so struck with horror at being measured for his irons that he soon expired. They were hanged at Chichester on the 18th of January 1749, amidst such a concourse of spectators as is seldom seen on the occasion of a public execution. Carter was hung in chains near Rake in Sussex, Tapner on Rook's Hill near Chichester, and Cobby and Hammond at Selsey Isle, on the beach where they sometimes landed their smuggled goods, and where they could be seen at a great distance east and west. Samuel Couchman and John Morgan, Lieutenant of Marines, Thomas Knight, carpenter, and others. Shot for mutiny. The Chesterfield man-of-war, under the command of Captain O'Brien Dudley, was stationed off Cape Coast Castle, on the coast of Africa, when a dangerous mutiny broke out among the crew, of whom the above-named officers were the leaders. They were charged on their trial with exciting and encouraging mutiny, and running away with His Majesty's ship Chesterfield on the 10th day of October 1748, from the coast of Africa, leaving their captain, 2 lieutenants with other officers, and some seamen on shore. It appeared from the evidence adduced before the court-martial by which the prisoners were tried, and which was presided over by Sir Edward Hawke, that on the 15th of October 1748, Captain Dudley, being on shore at Cape Coast Castle, sent off his barge to Lieutenant Couchman, ordering him to send the cutter with the boatswain of the ship to see the tents struck, and to bring everything belonging to the ship on board that night. Couchman, however, directly ordered the barge to be hoisted in, and the boatswain to turn all hands on the quarter-deck, and then coming from his cabin with a drawn sword, said, "Here I am, God damn me, and I will stand by you while I have a drop of blood in my body." He was accompanied by John Morgan, the 2nd Lieutenant of Marines, Thomas Knight the carpenter, his mate John Place, a principal actor, and about 30 seamen with cutlasses. They gave 3 huzzas and threw their hats overboard, damning old hats, and saying that they would soon get new. Couchman now sent for the boatswain to know if he would stand by him and go with him, but he replied, "No, and said, "For God's sake, sir, be ruled by reason, and consider what you are about." Couchman threatened to put him in irons if he did not join in with him, but the boatswain told him he never would be in such piratical designs, and he was immediately ordered into custody, and 2 sentinels put over him. Couchman soon after sent for Gillam, the mate of the ship, but he also refusing to join him was put into custody with 5 or 6 others. They were confined, however, only 5 or 6 hours, for in the middle of the night after their confinement, Couchman sent for them into the great cabin, desired them to sit and drink punch, and then dismissed them. The next day the boatswain was invited to dinner by the new commander, who began to rail against Captain Dudley, and proposed to him to sign a paper. He refused indignantly, and was immediately dismissed. When he quitted the great cabin he went to the gunner, who informed him that he had 20 pistols still at his disposal, and it was determined that an effort should be made that night to recover the ship from the mutineers. When evening drew on, the boatswain proceeded to sound the ship's company, and he soon found about 30 of the seamen, besides the mates, gunner's mates, and coxswain of the barge, ready to aid him. The boatswain took the command on himself, and the first step which he took was to get all the irons or bilboes on the forecastle. He then sent for the 20 pistols, which were all loaded. He next ordered 3 men upon the grand magazine, and 2 to the abaft, and the remainder, who had no pistols, to stay by the bilboes, and secure as many prisoners as he should send. This disposition being made, he went directly down on the deck, where he divided his small company into 2 parties, and one going down the main, and the other the fore hatchway. They soon secured 11 or 12 of the ringleaders, and sent them up to the forecastle without the least noise. The 2 parties then joined and went directly to the great cabin, where they secured Couchman and Morgan, with the carpenter, whom they immediately confined in different parts of the vessel. The ship being thus secured, the captain again boarded her, and took the command of her, and on her return to England the mutineers were brought to trial. The court-martial having found them guilty of the crimes imputed to them, they were shot in the month of June 1749. The boatswain, Roger Winkett, was afterwards rewarded with £300 a year as master attendant of Woolwich Dockyard. John Mills executed for murder. The case of this felon becomes remarkable from the fact of the criminal being the son of Richard Mills the elder, whose ignominious fate we have just recorded. It appears that he was engaged in the robbery of the custom house, but escaped, and soon after his father, brother, and their accomplices were hanged, he thought of going to Bristol, with a view of embarking for France, and having hinted his intentions to some others, they resolved to accompany him. Stopping at a house on the road, they met with one Richard Hawkins, whom they asked to go with them, but the poor fellow hesitating, they put him on horseback behind Mills, and carried him to the Dog and Partridge, on Slendon Common, which was kept by John Reynolds. They had not been long in the house when complaint was made that 2 bags of tea had been stolen, and Hawkins was charged with the robbery. He steadily denied any knowledge of the affair, but they obliged him to pull off his clothes, and having stripped themselves they began to whip him with the most unrelenting barbarity. And Curtis, one of the gang, said he did know of the robbery, and if he did not confess he would whip him till he did, for he had whipped many a rogue, and washed his hands in his blood. The villains continued whipping the poor wretch till their breath was almost exhausted, when at length the unfortunate man mentioned something of his father and brother, on which Mills and Curtis said they would go and fetch them, but Hawkins expired soon after they had left the house. On their way back they met Winter, one of their companions, who informed them of this fact, when they dismissed the men whom they had compelled to accompany them, saying that they should be sent for when they were wanted. Their next anxiety was as to the mode in which they should dispose of the body, and it was proposed to throw it into a well in an adjacent park. But this being objected to, they carried it 12 miles, and having tied stones to it in order to sink it, they threw it into a pond in Parham Park, belonging to Sir Cecil Bishop, and in this place it lay more than 2 months before it was discovered. Mills was afterwards taken into custody on the information of Pring, an outlawed smuggler, and, being tried, was convicted. The country being at that time filled with smugglers, a rescue was feared, wherefore he was conducted to the place of execution by a guard of soldiers. When there he prayed with the clergyman, confessed that he had led a bad life, acknowledged the murder of Hawkins, desired that all young people would take warning by his untimely end, and humbly implored the forgiveness of God. He was executed on Slendon Common on the 12th of August 1749, and afterwards hung in chains on the same spot. Amy Hutchinson, burnt for the murder of her husband. This malefactor was born of indigent parents in the Isle of Ely, and having received a poor education at the age of 16, she attracted the attention of a young man, whose love she returned with equal affection. Her father, being apprised of the connection, strictly charged his daughter to decline it, but there was no arguing against love. The intimacy continued till it became criminal. The young fellow having soon grown tired of her, he went off to London, and she determined to revenge herself upon him for his infidelity, by marrying another suitor named John Hutchinson, who had previously been disagreeable to her. The marriage accordingly took place, but her first admirer happening to return from London just as the newly wedded pair were coming out of church, the bride was greatly affected at the recollection of former scenes, and the irrevocable ceremony which had now passed. Unable to love the man she had married, she doted to distraction on him she had lost, and only a few days after her marriage admitted him to his former intimacy with her. Hutchinson becoming jealous of his wife, a quarrel ensued, in consequence of which he beat her with great severity, but this producing no alteration in her conduct, he had recourse to drinking, with a view to avoid the pain of reflection on his situation. In the interim, his wife and the young fellow continued their guilty intercourse uninterrupted, but, considering the life of her husband as a bar to their happiness, it was resolved to remove him by poison. For this purpose the wife purchased a quantity of arsenic, and Mr. Hutchinson being afflicted with an ague, and wishing for something warm to drink, she put some arsenic in ale, of which he drank very plentifully, and then she left him, saying she would go and buy something for his dinner. Meeting her lover, she acquainted him with what had passed, on which he advised her to buy more poison, fearing the first might not be sufficient to operate, but its effects were fatal, and Hutchinson died about dinner-time on the same day. The deceased was buried on the following Sunday, and the next day the former lover renewed his visits, which occasioned the neighbours to talk very freely of the affair. The young widow was taken into custody on suspicion of having committed the murder. The body being exhumed, it was found that death had been caused by poison, and the prisoner was convicted and sentenced to death. She was strangled and burned at Ely on the 7th of November 1750, confessing the crime of which she had been found guilty. End of Part 18. Part 19 of the Chronicles of Crime by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 19. John Carr, executed for forgery. This offender was born of respectable parents, who gave him a good education in the north of Ireland. Having gone to Dublin at the age of 16 years, he soon afterwards entered into business as a wine merchant, but being uncontrolled, he fell into bad habits and company, and was compelled to give up his trade. An associate inviting him to join him at Kilkenny, he proceeded thither by coach, and seeing a lady in the conveyance, the elegance of her appearance and manners impressed him with an idea that she was of rank. He determined, if possible, to profit by the opportunity afforded him. He handed her into the inn, and, a proposal being made that the company should sup together, it was agreed to on all hands, and while the supper was preparing, Carr applied himself to the coachman to learn the history of the young lady, but all the information he could obtain was, that he had taken her up at Dublin, and that she was going to the Spa at Mallow. He was determined, however, to become better acquainted with her, and prevailed on the company to repose themselves the next day at Kilkenny, to take a view of the Duke of Ormond's seat, and the curiosities of the town. This proposal being acceded to, the evening was spent in the utmost harmony and good humour, and the fair stranger even then conceived an idea of making a conquest of Mr. Carr, from whose appearance she was induced to suppose that he was a man of distinction. It was now diamond cut diamond, and in the morning the fair incognita dressed herself to great advantage, not forgetting the ornament of jewels which she wore in abundance, so that, when she entered the room, Carr was astonished at her appearance. She found the influence she had over him, and resolved to afford him an early opportunity of speaking his sentiments, and while the company were walking in the gallery of the Duke of Ormond's palace, an occasion presented itself which was not lost by either party. The lady at first affected displeasure at so explicit a declaration, but soon assuming a more affable deportment, she told him that she was an Englishwoman of rank, that his person was not disagreeable to her, and that if he was a man of fortune, and the consent of her relations could be obtained, she should not be averse to listening to his addresses. She further said that she was going to spend part of the summer at Mallow, where his company would be agreeable, and he followed her to that place, contrary to the advice of his friend, who had formed a very unfavourable opinion of the lady's character. It is needless to say that the company of so refined and elegant a person was not to be kept without some expenses, which were not of a very moderate character, and the difficulties in which our hero had already placed himself were in no wise diminished by his new connection. He remained with her, however, until the end of the season induced them to return to Dublin, and then a trip to England was proposed, preparatory to the final steps being taken to complete the nuptial arrangements. The gallantry and wits of the gentleman were sorely tested to procure the requisite funds for the trip, but he at length succeeded in obtaining such a sum as he and the lady deemed sufficient. The passage only remained to be secured, and the too credulous sharper was employed in obtaining it, but in his absence the lady shipped all the effects on board a vessel bound for Amsterdam, and having dressed herself in a man's apparel, she embarked and sailed, leaving Carr to regret his ill-judged credulity. Thus reduced to want, he went to London, and having enlisted as a foot soldier, he was discharged after several years' service. He subsequently entered as a marine, but soon afterwards came to London again, and opened a shop in Hog Lane, St. Giles. He now married a girl who he thought had money, but soon discovering her poverty, he abandoned her, and removed to Short's Gardens, where he entered into partnership with a cork cutter. But having obtained the promise of support from his partner's customers, he set upon his own account, and was tolerably successful, though his passion for gambling prevented his retaining any part of the produce of his business. His new companions at the gaming table, having an eye to their own profit, offered to procure him a wife of fortune, though they knew he had a wife living, and actually contrived to introduce him to a young lady of property, with whom a marriage would probably have taken place, but that one of them, struck with remorse of conscience, developed the affair to her father, and frustrated the whole scheme. Being now again thrown upon his own resources, he engaged himself as a porter to a merchant, but while in this condition, his master having entrusted him with a cheque for £60, he procured it to be cashed, and having spent the money in the lowest debauchery, he again entered as a marine. There being something in his deportment superior to the vulgar, he was advanced to the rank of sergeant, in which he behaved so well that his officers treated him with considerable favour. The vessel in which he sailed was of considerable power, and taking a merchant ship richly laden, and soon afterwards several smaller vessels, the prize money amounted to a considerable sum. This gave Carr an idea that very great advantages might be obtained by privateering, and having procured a discharge, He entered on board a privateer, and was made master-at-arms. In a few days the privateer took 2 French ships, one of which they carried to Bristol, and the other into the harbour of Poole, and refitting their ship they sailed again, and in 2 days took a French privateer, and gave chase to 3 others, which they found to have been English vessels belonging to Falmouth, which had been captured by a French privateer. These they retook, and carried them into Falmouth, in their passage to which place they made prize of a valuable French ship, the produce of which contributed to enrich the crew. On their next trip they saw a ship in full chase of them, on which they prepared for a vigorous defence, and an action soon after taking place, many hands were lost by the French, who at length attempted to sheer off, but were taken after a chase of some leagues. The commander of the English privateer, being desperately wounded in the engagement, died in a few days, on which Carr courted his widow, and a marriage would have taken place, but that she was seized with a violent fever, which deprived her of life, but not before she had bequeathed him all she was possessed of. Having disposed of her effects, he repaired to London, where he commenced smuggler, but his ill-gotten goods being seized by the officers of the revenue, he took to the still more dangerous practice of forging seamen's wills, and gained money thus for some time, but being apprehended he was brought to trial at the Old Bailey, convicted, and was sentenced to die. He was of the Romish persuasion, and died with decent resignation to his fate. Carr was hanged at Tyburn on the 16th of November 1750. Norman Ross, executed for murder. About the time at which this man met his most deserved punishment, the public journals teemed with accounts of the impudence and crimes of the party-coloured tribe of servants, denominated footmen. To such a daring pitch had their impudence arrived, that they created a riot at the theatre in Drury Lane, even in the presence of the heir apparent to the throne. One evening, when the Prince and Princess of Wales, the father and mother of King George III, attended the performance, these miscreants commenced a dreadful uproar. It was then the custom to admit servants in livery into the upper gallery gratis, in compliment to their employers, on whom they were supposed to be in attendance, and not content with peaceably witnessing the performance, they frequently interrupted those who had paid for admission, and assuming the prerogative of critics, hissed or applauded with the most offensive clamour. In consequence of these violent proceedings, the manager shut the door against them, unless they each paid their shilling. Upon an occasion when that part of the royal family already mentioned were present, they mustered in a gang, to the number of 300, broke open the doors of the theatre, fought their way to the very door of the stage, and in their progress wounded 25 peaceable people. Colonel de Vale, then an active magistrate for Westminster, happened to be present, and in vain attempted to read a proclamation against such an outrage, but though they obstructed him in his duty, he caused the ringleaders to be secured, and the next day committed 3 of them to Newgate. At the ensuing sessions they were convicted of the riot and sentenced to imprisonment. In the meantime the choler of these upstarts was raised to such a pitch that they sent the following threat to the manager: to Mr. Fleetwood, in Lincoln's Inn Fields, Master of the Theatre, Drury Lane. Sir, we are willing to admonish you before we attempt our design, and provided you use us civil and admit us into our gallery, which is our property according to formalities, and if you think proper to come to a composition this way, you'll hear no further, and if not, our intention is to combine in a body incognito and reduce the playhouse to the ground. Valuing no detection, we are indemnified. The manager carried this letter to the Lord Chamberlain, who ordered a detachment of 50 soldiers to do duty there each night, and thus deterred the saucy knaves from carrying their threats into execution. At the Edinburgh Theatre it was also a custom to admit men wearing the badge of servitude into the gallery gratis, and when Garrick's inimitable farce, High Life Below Stairs, wherein the waste and impudence of domestic servants of rich men is completely exposed, was performed there, a most violent clamour broke out in the gallery, so as entirely to interrupt the performance, and put the other part of the audience in fear of the consequences. The hardy Scotchmen, however, laid hold of the rioters and kicked every footman, who alone were concerned, out of the house, where, without paying, they never more entered. Having thus referred to an evil which existed in 1751, and which even to this moment continues to exist to a considerable extent, namely the overbearing insolence of the fellows who usually fill the situations of domestic servants in the families of the rich, it is time to proceed to the history of the subject of this sketch. Ross was born of decent parents in Inverness, and received an education by which he would have been fitted to fill a situation in a merchant's counting-house. The difficulty in obtaining such employment, however, induced him to enter the service of a lady, who had always exhibited great kindness towards his family, and he soon afterwards accompanied her son to the Continent in the capacity of a valet de chambre. He continued in this situation during about 5 years, when he returned to Scotland and was employed by an attorney in Edinburgh. But having contracted an intimacy among other servants, from their instruction he acquired all the fashionable habits of drinking, swearing, and gaming, and was dismissed on account of his impudence and the irregularities of his conduct. He was subsequently engaged by a Mrs. Hume, a widow lady of good fortune, whose residence during the summer was at Ayton, a village about 4 miles from Berwick upon Tweed. The extravagance of our hero, and an unfortunate intercourse which he had with a fellow servant, soon compelled him to look for some other means of procuring money, besides that which was honestly afforded him by his mistress, and having exhausted the patience of his friends by borrowing from them repeatedly, he formed the resolution of robbing his employer. It would appear that Mrs. Hume slept in a room on the first floor, and that the keys of her bureau were usually placed under her head for safety. Sunday night was the time fixed upon for the commission of the robbery, and, waiting in his bedroom, without undressing himself till he judged the family to be asleep, he descended, and leaving his shoes in the passage, proceeded to his lady's bedchamber. Upon his endeavouring to get possession of the keys, the lady was disturbed, and being dreadfully alarmed, called for assistance, but the rest of the family lying at a distant part of the house, her screams were not heard. Ross immediately seized a clasp knife that lay on the table, and cut his mistress's throat in a most dreadful manner. This horrid act was no sooner perpetrated than, without waiting to put on his shoes, or to secure either money or other effects, he leapt out of the window, and after travelling several miles, concealed himself in a field of corn. In the morning the gardener discovered a livery hat, which the murderer had dropped in descending from the window, and, suspecting that something extraordinary had happened, he alarmed his fellow servants. The disturbance in the house brought the 2 daughters of Mrs. Hume downstairs, but no words can express the horror and consternation of the young ladies upon beholding their parent weltering in her blood, and the fatal instrument of death lying on the floor. Ross being absent, and his shoes and hat being found, it was concluded that he must have committed the barbarous deed, and the butler therefore mounted a horse and alarmed the country, lest the murderous villain should escape. The butler was soon joined by great numbers of horsemen, and towards the conclusion of the day, when both men and horses were nearly exhausted through excessive fatigue, the murderer was discovered in a field of standing corn. He was immediately secured, and being brought to trial, he had the effrontery to declare that he was admitted to share his mistress's bed, and that his custom was always to leave his shoes at the parlour door. That on the night of the murder he proceeded as usual to her room, but on entering it his horror was aroused at discovering her to be murdered. He leapt out of the window to search for the perpetrators of the deed, and dropping his hat, he thought it better not to return until night. Having been found guilty, he was sentenced to have his right hand chopped off, then to be hanged till dead, the body to be hung in chains, and the right hand to be affixed to the top of the gibbet, with the knife made use of in the commission of the murder. Upon receiving sentence of death, he began seriously to reflect on his miserable situation, and the next day he requested the attendance of Mr. James Craig, one of the ministers of Edinburgh, to whom he confessed his guilt, declaring that there was no foundation for his reflections against the chastity of the deceased. 6 weeks elapsed between the time of his trial and that of his execution, during which he showed every sign of the most sincere penitence, and refused to accompany 2 prisoners who broke out of jail, saying he had no desire to recover his liberty, but that on the contrary he would cheerfully submit to the utmost severity of punishment, that he might make atonement for his wickedness. The day appointed for putting the sentence of the law into force being arrived, Ross walked to the place of execution, holding Mr. Craig by the arm. Having addressed a pathetic speech to the populace, and prayed some time with great fervency of devotion, the rope was put around his neck, and he laid his right hand upon the block, when it was struck off by the executioner at 2 blows. He was immediately afterwards run up to the gallows, when, feeling the rope drawing tight, by a convulsive motion of the arm he struck his bloody wrist against his cheek, which gave it a ghastly appearance. The sentence was subsequently fully carried into effect. The execution took place on the 8th of January, 1751. Thomas Colley, executed for murder. This offender was a victim to his own feelings of superstition. At the time of his crime and execution, the belief in witchcraft was almost universal, and Colley was hanged for the murder of a poor old woman named Osborne, whose qualities as a witch he tested by ducking her in a pond until she was dead, thereby indisputably proving to the satisfaction of all, and to the credit of the deceased woman, how unjustifiable were the suspicions which had been entertained of her character. The evidence given against the prisoner was to the following effect. On the 18th of April, 1751, a man named Nichols went to William Dell, the crier at Hemel Hempstead in Hertfordshire, and delivered to him a paper to the following effect, which was to be cried: "This is to give notice that on Monday next a man and woman are to be publicly ducked at Tring, in this county, for their wicked crimes." This notice was given at Winslow and Leighton Buzzard, as well as at Hemel Hempstead, on the respective market days, and was heard by Mr. Barton, overseer of the parish of Tring, who, being informed that the persons intended to be ducked were John Osborne and Ruth his wife, and having no doubt of the good character of both the parties, sent them to the workhouse as a protection from the rage of the mob. On the day appointed for the practice of the infernal ceremony, an immense number of people, supposed to be not fewer than 5,000, assembled near the workhouse at Tring, vowing revenge against Osborne and his wife as a wizard and a witch, and demanding that they should be delivered up to their fury. In support of their demands they pulled down a wall belonging to the workhouse, and broke the windows and window frames. On the preceding evening the master of the workhouse, suspecting some violence from what he heard of the disposition of the people, had sent Osborne and his wife to the vestry room belonging to the church, as a place the most likely to secure them from insult. The mob would not give credit to the master of the workhouse that the parties were removed, but rushing into the house searched it through, examining the closets, boxes, trunks, and even the salt box, in quest of them. There being a hole in the ceiling, which had been left by the plasterers, Colley, who was one of the most active of the gang, exclaimed, "Let us search the ceiling," and this being done, but of course without success, they swore that they would pull down the house and set fire to Tring if the parties were not produced. The master of the workhouse, apprehensive that they would carry their threats into execution, and unmindful of the safety of the unfortunate wretches whom it was his duty to protect, at length gave up their place of concealment, and the whole mob, with Colley at their head, forthwith marched off to the church and brought them off in triumph. Their persons secured, they were carried to a pond called Marlston Mere, where they were stripped and tied up separately in cloths. A rope was then bound round the body of the woman, under her armpits, and 2 men dragged her into the pond, and through it several times, Colley going into the pond and, with a stick, turning her from side to side. Having ducked her repeatedly in this manner, they placed her by the side of the pond and dragged the old man in and ducked him. Then he was put by, and the woman ducked again as before, Colley making the same use of his stick. With this cruelty the husband was treated twice over, and the wife 3 times, during the last of which the cloth in which she was wrapped came off, and she appeared quite naked. Not satisfied with this barbarity, Colley pushed his stick against her breast, and the poor woman attempted to lay hold of it, but her strength being now exhausted, she expired on the spot. Colley then went round the pond collecting money of the populace for the sport he had shown them in ducking the old witch, as he called her. The mob now departed to their several habitations, and the body being taken out of the pond was examined by Mr. Foster, a surgeon, and the coroner's inquest being summoned on the occasion, Mr. Foster deposed that, on examining the body of the deceased, he found no wound, either internal or external, except a little place that had the skin off on one of her breasts, and it was his opinion that she was suffocated with water and mud. Hereupon Colley was taken into custody, and when his trial came on, Mr. Foster deposed to the same effect as above mentioned, and there being a variety of other strong proofs of the prisoner's guilt, he was convicted and received sentence of death. His defence was that he had endeavoured to protect the old people from violence, instead of attempting to injure them. After conviction he seemed to behold his guilt in its true light of enormity. He became, as far as could be judged, sincerely penitent for his sins, and made good use of the short time he had to live in the solemn preparation for eternity. The day before his execution he was removed from the jail of Hertford, under the escort of 100 men of the Oxford Blues, commanded by 7 officers, and being lodged in the jail of St. Albans, was put into a chaise at 5 o'clock the next morning with the hangman, and reached the place of execution about 11, where his wife and daughter came to take leave of him. The minister of Tring assisted him in his last moments, and he died exhibiting all the marks of unfeigned penitence. He was executed on the 24th of August, 1751, and his body afterwards hung in chains at a place called Gubblecut, near which the offence was committed. It is not a little remarkable that, at so recent a period, so many people as composed this mob should be found so benighted in intellect and utterly uninformed as to be guilty of so miserable and so glaring a piece of absurdity and wickedness as that which was proved in the evidence against the prisoner. In former ages, it is true, not only the people but even the authorities of the land believed in witchcraft and sorcery, but it is indeed extraordinary that in the 18th century a scene such as that described could have been permitted to occur at a village within 30 miles of the metropolis. The following copy of an indictment, furnished us by a friend who took it from the American court record, must prove a matter of curiosity to the reader at the present enlightened era. Essex, a town in the colony of Massachusetts Bay in New England. The jurors of our sovereign Lord and Lady, the King and Queen, King William and Queen Mary, present, that George Burroughs, late of Falmouth, in the province of Massachusetts Bay, clerk, a Presbyterian minister of the Gospel, the 9th day of May, and divers other days and times, as well before as after, certain detestable arts called witchcraft and sorceries, wickedly and feloniously, have used, practised, and exercised at and in the town of Salem, in the county aforesaid, upon and against one Mary Walcott, single woman, by which said wicked arts the said Mary, on the day aforesaid, and divers other days and times, as well before as after, was and is tortured, afflicted, pined, consumed, wasted, and tormented against the peace, etc. A witness by the name Anne Putnam deposed as follows: On the 8th of May 1692 I saw the apparition of George Burroughs, who grievously tormented me, and urged me to write in his book, which I refused. He then told me that his 2 first wives would appear to me presently, and tell me a great many lies, but I must not believe them. Then immediately appeared to me the forms of 2 women in winding sheets and napkins about their heads, at which I was greatly affrighted. They turned their faces towards Mr. Burroughs, and looked red and angry, and told him that he had been very cruel to them, and that their blood called for vengeance against him, and they also told him that they should be clothed with white robes in heaven, when he should be cast down into hell, and he immediately vanished away. And as soon as he was gone, the women turned their faces towards me, and looked as pale as a white wall, and told me they were Mr. Burroughs' 2 wives, and that he had murdered them, and one told me she was his first wife, and he stabbed her under the left breast, and put a piece of sealing wax in the wound, and she pulled aside the winding sheet, and showed me the place. She also told me that she was in the house where Mr. Darris, the minister of Danvers, then lived, when it was done. And the other told me that Mr. Burroughs and a wife, that he hath now, killed her in the vessel as she was coming to see her friends from the eastward, because they would not have one another. And they both charged me to tell these things to the magistrates before Mr. Burroughs' face, and if he did not own them, they did not know but they should appear this morning. This morning also appeared to me another woman in a winding sheet, and told me that she was Goodman Fuller's first wife, and Mr. Burroughs killed her because there was a difference between her husband and him. Upon the above, and some other such evidence, was this unfortunate man condemned and executed. The days are now happily past, when such monstrous absurdities are heard of. End of Part 19. Part 20 of the Chronicles of Crime, Part 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 20. Frederick Caulfield, executed for murder. The following is a remarkable instance, if it be true, of a dream occasioning the discovery of a murder. Adam Rogers, a creditable man who kept a public house at Portlaw, a small village 9 or 10 miles from Waterford, in Ireland, dreamed one night that he saw 2 men at a particular green spot on an adjacent mountain, one of them a sickly-looking man, the other remarkably strong and large. Then he fancied that he saw the little man murder the other, and awoke in great agitation. The circumstances of the dream were so distinct and forcible that he continued much affected by them, and on the next morning he was extremely startled at seeing 2 strangers enter his house about 11 o'clock in the forenoon, who resembled precisely the 2 men that he fancied he had seen. After the strangers had taken some refreshment, and were about to depart, in order to prosecute their journey, Rogers earnestly endeavoured to dissuade the little man from quitting his house, and going on with his fellow traveller, and he assured him that if he would remain with him that day, he would himself accompany him to Carrick the next morning, that being the town to which they were proceeding. He was unwilling and ashamed to tell the cause of his being so solicitous to separate him from his companion, but as he observed that Hickey, which was the name of the little man, seemed to be quiet and gentle in his deportment, and had money about him, and that the other had a ferocious bad countenance, he dreaded that something fatal would happen, and wished, at all events, to keep them asunder. The humane precautions which he took, however, proved ineffectual, for Caulfield, such was the other's name, prevailed upon Hickey to continue with him on their way to Carrick, declaring that as they had long travelled together they should not part, but should remain together until he should see Hickey safely arrive at the habitation of his friends. They accordingly set out together, and in about an hour after they left Portlaw, in a lonely part of the mountains, just near the place observed by Rogers in his dream, Caulfield took the opportunity of murdering his companion. It appeared afterwards, from his own account of the horrid transaction, that as they were getting over the ditch, he struck Hickey on the back part of his head with a stone, and when he fell down into the trench in consequence of the blow, Caulfield gave him several stabs with a knife, and cut his throat so deeply that the head was almost severed from the body. He then rifled Hickey's pockets of all the money in them, took part of his clothes and everything else of value about him, and afterwards proceeded on his way to Carrick. He had not been long gone when the body, still warm, was discovered by some labourers who were returning to their work from dinner. The report of the murder soon reached Portlaw, and Rogers and his wife went to the place and instantly knew the body of him whom they had in vain endeavoured to dissuade from going on with his treacherous companion. They at once declared their suspicions that the murder was perpetrated by the fellow traveller of the deceased, and an immediate search was made, and Caulfield was apprehended at Waterford on the second day after. He was brought to trial at the ensuing assizes, and convicted of the fact. After sentence, the prisoner confessed that he had been guilty of the murder, and stated that he had accompanied Hickey home from the West Indies, and that observing that he had money in his possession, he had long contemplated the deed, which he afterwards effected, but was unable to meet with a good opportunity until their arrival at the spot alluded to. He was executed at Waterford in the year 1751. William Parsons, Esquire, executed for returning from transportation. The unhappy subject of this narrative was the eldest son of Sir William Parsons, Baronet, of the county of Nottingham, and was born in London in the year 1717. He was placed under the care of a pious and learned divine at Pepperharrow, in Surrey, where he received the first rudiments of education. In a little more than 3 years he was removed to Eton College, where it was intended that he should qualify himself for one of the universities. But his misconduct prevented his friends from carrying out their intentions in this respect, for having been detected in various acts of petty pilfering, he was dismissed from the school, and sent home to his father. His disposition was now found to be of so unpromising a character that it was thought advisable to send him to sea, and an appointment was procured for him as midshipman on board a vessel of war lying at Spithead, which was immediately about to proceed to Jamaica. Our hero soon obtained the necessary outfit and joined his ship, but some accident detaining her beyond the time when it was expected she would sail, he applied for leave of absence and went on shore, but having no intention to return, he directed his course towards a small town about 10 miles from Portsmouth, called Bishop's Waltham, where, by representations of his respectability, he soon ingratiated himself into the favour of the principal inhabitants. His figure being pleasing, and his manner of address easy and polite, he found but little difficulty in recommending himself to the ladies, and he became greatly enamoured of a beautiful and accomplished young lady, the daughter of a physician of considerable practice, and prevailed upon her to promise that she would yield to him her hand in marriage. News of the intended alliance coming to the knowledge of his father and of his uncle, the latter directly hastened to Waltham to prevent a union which would have produced consequences of the worst character to the contracting parties, and having apprised the friends of the young lady with the condition and situation of the intended bridegroom, their consent was withdrawn, and our hero was with some difficulty induced to rejoin his ship. Restless, however, in his new employment, he had scarcely reached Jamaica when he determined that he would desert and return to England, and the sailing of the Sheerness man-of-war for that place afforded him an opportunity of carrying his design into execution, of which he lost no time in availing himself. A new effort to obtain the hand of his former love was as unsuccessful as that which he had first made, and his uncle, having ascertained the fact of his presence in England, induced him at once to go back to the residence of his father with promises of future amendment. For a time his determination to alter his course of life was obeyed, but soon again launching forth into habits of irregularity, he was dispatched as midshipman on board the Romney for the coast of Newfoundland, On his revisiting England after an absence of some years, he was mortified to learn that the Duchess of Northumberland, to whom he was distantly related, had revoked a will in his favour which she had made, and had bequeathed to his sister the fortune which he knew had been intended for him, and now, finding himself spurned by his friends, he was soon reduced to a condition of absolute necessity. Through the friendly intervention of a Mr. Bailey, however, he procured an engagement at James Fort on the river Gambia, but here, as in all other situations unfortunate, he contrived to engage himself in a quarrel, in consequence of which he was compelled to return to Europe, a step, however, which he was alone enabled to take by setting at defiance the commands of the governor O'Fleur, that he should not quit the colony, and take his passage under an assumed name on board a homeward-bound trader. Arrived in London, he found no friend to whom he could apply for assistance or relief, but at length discovering the residence of his father, he went to him and implored some aid, even if he should not give him any further countenance. 5 shillings, and advice to enter a horse regiment as a private, were all that he could obtain, however, and rendered wretched by his miserable condition, the grave appeared to be the only resource to which he could look for consolation. But a thought suggested itself in time to prevent his rashly taking away his life, that he should represent himself as his brother, who had recently come into a fortune, and under the pretext that he was entitled to the legacy, he committed frauds upon various tradesmen to a considerable amount. His impudence and his ingenuity were now required to be exerted in order to relieve him from the difficulty in which he was involved in consequence of this proceeding, but his good fortune in throwing him in the way of a young lady of good fortune, to whom he was married, placed in his power the means of retrieving his lost character and his degraded position. The marriage was solemnized on the 10th of February 1740, and the intercession of his friends, to whom he was now with difficulty again reconciled, procured for him an ensigncy in the 34th Regiment of Foot from the Right Honourable Arthur Onslow. He appeared at this time to be desirous of reappearing in that position in society to which his birth entitled him, but having hired a house in Poland Street, his extravagant mode of living again, in the course of a few years, reduced him to a condition of great distress. He was compelled to sell his commission in order to recruit his shattered finances, and then, in order to meet new demands, he was guilty of various forgeries upon which he procured money to a very large amount. For 2 years he pursued new plans of iniquity with considerable success, but then, being apprehended in the act of putting off a forged draft, he was committed to Maidstone jail, and having been convicted at the ensuing assizes, was sentenced to be transported for 7 years. In the month of September 1749 he was put on board the Thames transport bound for Maryland, and in the following November he was landed at Annapolis in that place. He was now guilty of new offences, even more criminal than those which he had before committed, and having first ridden off with a horse belonging to the person to whom he was assigned as a servant, and committed several robberies, he shaped his course to Potomac, from whence he immediately sailed for England. That refuge for the destitute of all classes at this period, the road, was now the only resource left to our hero, and for a time he pursued his new occupation with infinite determination and proportionate success, but at length, having attempted to rob Mr. Fuller, the gentleman by whom he had before been prosecuted, he was recognized by him, and being vigorously attacked, was at length compelled to surrender, and was secured and committed to Newgate. It was necessary to prove no new offence against him at his trial, but all that was required was to identify him as a transported felon, who had returned to England before the termination of the period for which he had been sentenced to be banished, and this being done, he was declared to have forfeited his life to the laws of his country. His distressed father and wife used all their interest to obtain for him a pardon, but in vain. He was an old offender, and judged by no means a fit object for mercy. While Parsons remained in Newgate, his behaviour was such that it could not be determined whether he entertained a proper idea of his dreadful situation. There is indeed but too much reason to fear that the hopes of a reprieve, in which he deceived himself even to the last moments of his life, induced him to neglect the necessary preparation for eternity. His taking leave of his wife afforded a scene extremely affecting. He recommended to her parental protection his only child, and regretted that his misconduct had put it in the power of a censorious world to reflect upon both the mother and son. At the place of execution he joined in the devotional exercises with a fervency of zeal that proved him to be convinced of the necessity of obtaining the pardon of his Creator. William Parsons, Esquire, suffered at Tyburn on the 11th of February, 1751. William Chandler, transported for perjury. The scheme laid by this man for the purpose of plunder has scarcely ever been equalled in art and consummate hypocrisy. It is to be observed that in the case of every robbery committed, the hundred where it happens, or the county at large, is responsible for the amount of the loss which the injured person in such cases may sustain. In Chandler's attempt at fraud founded upon this law, he implicated 3 innocent men by whom he pretended to have been robbed, and who, had his tale ultimately received credit, might have lost their lives. Happily his plot was frustrated, and the real offender was brought to justice. William Chandler was the only child of Mr. Thomas Chandler of Woodborough, near Devizes, a gentleman farmer of moderate means. At an early age the youth was articled to Mr. Banks, who was the clerk of the Goldsmiths' Company, but before 2 years had elapsed, in consequence of frequent disputes which took place, he was transferred to Mr. Hill, a respectable attorney in Clifford's Inn. His clerkship being nearly expired, the necessity of providing himself with the means of commencing practice on his own account suggested itself into his mind, and he therefore laid a plan to procure the possession of as much money as he could, and then going a journey into the country upon some plausible pretence, to trump up a story of being robbed, and sue the 100 for the amount. Upon representations to his father that he had a good match in view, the old man gave him an estate of the value of £400, and then producing the deeds to his master, together with £500 which he had obtained by other means, but which he represented that he had received from a rich uncle in Suffolk, he procured from him the advance of £500 more, in order, as he alleged, that he might take a mortgage upon some property at Enford, within a few miles of his father's house. Mr. Hill demanded some security for his money, and his clerk immediately proposed to give him a mortgage upon his own estate. In order to favour the appearance of the probability of his proceedings, he engaged with a Mrs. Poor, who lived at Enford, in a transaction, having the mortgage of some land which she owned for its object, and the money having been duly advanced by his employer, he fixed the 25th of March, 1748, to meet Mrs. Poor, to hand over the money and receive the necessary papers. Early on the 24th, having turned most of his cash into small bills, to the amount of £900, he found, when he came to put these in canvas bags under his garters, where he proposed to carry them for safety, that they made too great a bundle, and therefore he took several of the bills, with some cash, amounting to £440, and exchanged them at the bank for 2 notes, one of £400 and the other of £40, the first of which, on his way home, he changed in his master's name at Sir Richard Hoare's for 1 note of £200 and 2 of £100 each. On his reaching the office he told his master that the bank clerks were a little out of humour at the trouble he had already given them, and that he had changed his small notes with a stranger in the bank hall for the notes which he in reality had received at Sir Richard Hoare's. Mr. Hill, at Chandler's request, having then written down the numbers and dates of the several bills, and having seen them safely put up, Chandler took leave of him, and about 12 o'clock set out. About 4 o'clock the same afternoon he reached Harehatch, distant 30 miles from London, where he stopped to refresh, and about 5, just as he had left his inn, He was, as he said, unfortunately met by 3 bargemen on foot, who, after they had robbed him of his watch and money, took him to a pit close by the road, and there stripped him of all his bank notes, bound his hands and feet, and left him, threatening to return and shoot him if he made the least noise. In this woeful condition, he said, he lay 3 hours, though the pit was so near the road that not a single horse could pass without his hearing. When night came, however, he jumped, bound as he was, near half a mile, all uphill, till, luckily for his purpose, he met one Avery, a simple shepherd, who cut the cords, and of whom the first question Chandler asked was, where a constable or tithing man lived. Avery conducted him to Richard Kelly's, the constable's, just by, and with him Mr. Chandler left the notices required by the statutes, with the description of the men who robbed him, so exactly that a person present remembered 3 such men to have passed by his house about the very time the robbery was said to have been committed, and the mayor of Reading, who was accidentally on the road, had a similar recollection of the bargemen whom he had met near Maidenhead Thicket between 4 and 5 the same day. Chandler then returned to the inn where he had refreshed, and after telling his deplorable tale and acquainting his landlord with his intention of suing the 100, he ordered a good supper and a bowl of punch, and sat down with as little concern as if nothing had happened. Next day he returned to London, acquainted his master with the pretended robbery, and requested his assistance. Mr. Hill gave him the memorandum he had of the numbers, dates, and sums of the notes, and sent him to the bank to stop payment. But instead of that he went to Mr. Tuffley, a silversmith in Cannon Street, bought a silver tankard, and in payment changed one of the notes for £100 which he had received the day before at Sir Richard Hoare's, and on his return to his master told him the bank did no business that day on account of the hurry the city was in with regard to a fire in Cornhill which had happened the night before. He therefore went again the following morning, and when he came back, being asked by Mr. Hill for the paper on which he had taken down the numbers, etc., he said he had left it with the clerks of the bank, who were to stop the notes, but that he had taken an exact copy of it. This, however, was false, for he had reserved Mr. Hill's copy, and left another at the bank, in which he had so craftily altered the numbers and dates of the 3 notes he received at Sir Richard Hoare's, amounting to £400, as to prevent their being stopped, and Mr. Hill remembering the difference. On the 26th he inserted a list of his notes, being 15 in all, with their dates and numbers, in the daily papers, offering a reward of £50 for the recovery of the whole, or in proportion for any part. But on the afternoon of the same day he withdrew his advertisement in all the daily papers, and took his own written copy away at each place. On the 29th of March he put the notice of the robbery and the description of the robbers in the London Gazette, as the law directs, except that he did not particularize the notes, as he had done in other papers. On the 12th of May following he made the proper information before a justice of the peace, but though Mr. Hill, his master, was with him, and had undertaken to manage the cause for him, yet he made the same omission in his information as in his advertisement in the London Gazette. All things being prepared, on the 18th of July 1748, Chandler's cause came on at Abingdon before a special jury, and after a hearing of 12 hours the jury retired, and then gave the prosecutor a verdict for £970, subject, however, to a case reserved for the opinion of the Court of Common Pleas, concerning the sufficiency of the description of the bank notes in the London Gazette. In the meantime Chandler, fearing that by what came out upon the trial he should soon be suspected, and that he might be arrested, obtained a protection from Lord Willoughby de Broke, and gave out that he was removed into Suffolk to reside, as he had before pretended, with his rich uncle. But in reality he retired to Colchester, where his brother-in-law Humphrey Smart had taken an inn, with whom he entered into co-partnership, and never came publicly to London afterwards. He was, however, obliged to correspond with his master, on account of the point of law which was soon to be argued, and therefore to obtain his letters without discovering his place of abode he ordered them to be directed to Mr. Thomas Chandler at Easton in Suffolk, to be left for him at the Crown at Audley, near Colchester. Mr. Hill having written several letters to Mr. Chandler, pressing him to come to town, as the term drew near, and he evading it by trifling excuses, the former began to suspect him, even before the point of law was determined. Just before this period, 12 of the notes, of which Mr. Chandler pretended to have been robbed, were all brought to the bank together, having been bought, October the 31st, 1748, at Amsterdam, of one John Smith, by Barnard Solomon, a broker there, and by him transmitted to his son Nathan Solomon, a broker in London. Upon further inquiry, it appeared that John Smith, who sold the notes, stayed but a few days in Holland, that he was seen in company with a Mr. Casson, a Holland trader, and came over in the packet with him. Mr. Casson was then found, and his description of John Smith answered to the person of Chandler, who was in consequence pressed by letter to come to town and face Casson to remove all suspicion, but he refused. In the interim the point of law was argued before the judges of the Common Pleas, when their determination was to the following effect: that as Chandler had not inserted the numbers of his notes in the Gazette, nor sworn to them when he made oath before the justice, the verdict must be set aside and the plaintiff non-suited, without the advantage of a new trial. But now the scene began to open apace, for about this time the very paper which Chandler left when he stopped payment of the notes at the bank was found, and upon its being seen by Mr. Hill, he at once saw that he had been deceived, and proceeded to take the necessary steps to secure his apprehension. The whole circumstances attending the case were soon traced upon a minute inspection of the bank books, as contrasted with those of the banking house of Messrs. Hoare and Co., and about midsummer 1749 Mr. Hill and others set out for Colchester, with a view of securing the person of the culprit. After a fruitless journey, however, of about 150 miles in search of the fugitive, they returned to the very inn at Colchester which was kept by the object of their search, and then departed for London without gaining any intelligence. Chandler, having seen his pursuers, thought it prudent to decamp, and proceeded to Coventry, where he took a small public house, but being desirous of making some reparation to his late master, he transmitted to him £150 by letter from Nottingham. By the postmark of his letter he was eventually traced to Coventry, and an indictment for perjury, in respect of the information on oath which he gave to the magistrates of the robbery, having been found against him, he was taken into custody on a judge's warrant, and removed to Abingdon, where on the 22nd of July 1750 he was arraigned on the indictment preferred against him. The witnesses being all in attendance, the prisoner traversed his trial until the next assizes, in pursuance of a right which he possessed, but then the facts already detailed having been proved in evidence, he was found guilty, and on the 16th of July 1751 he was sentenced to be transported for 7 years, having first undergone 3 months' imprisonment in the county jail. End of part 20.